The kingdom of Valdara lay draped in shadows as the last rays of the sun fell behind the jagged mountains. Its towers and walls carved from dark stone reflected a centuries-old history of power, pride, and cruelty. The people whispered of the Alpha King, ruler of all Valdara, a man whose strength was unmatched and whose word was law. Yet even he could not tame every curse, nor heal every wound that fate had laid upon his house. In the highest chamber of the royal palace, a child sat alone, his small hands tracing the intricate carvings on the walls. Aelor, the silent prince, was the king's only son. Though born a child of the strongest bloodline, he had never spoken a word. The palace healers and scholars called it a curse, a legacy of sins long past. But the truth lay deeper than any legend could describe. Aelor saw the world in ways others could not. He listened to emotions more than words, sensing the desires and fears of those around him. His silence was a shield and a key all at once. Outside the palace, beyond the river and the fields, lay the village of rejected souls. Among them lived Elira, a young Omega woman who had been cast away from her own people for being weak, for being different. She had learned to survive through her wits, her patience, and her care for those who had been forgotten. Children, sick villagers, and wandering travelers all found safety in her presence. She moved like a shadow through the forests, quiet, careful, and yet unafraid. There was a fire in her heart that no rejection could extinguish. The world of Valdara was one where strength ruled, where kings measured loyalty in blood, and where even whispers could decide life or death. Yet fate had a strange sense of irony, for it brought Aelor and Elira together in the cold heart of the forest one twilight, under skies painted with violet and gold. It began with a hunt. The Alpha King had sent his men into the woods to capture a so-called dangerous Omega, reported to wander the outskirts of his lands. The villagers spoke fearfully of Elira, describing her as cunning, elusive, and dangerous. But she was none of these things in the way the king imagined. She was merely alive in a world that tried to erase her. Aelor, curious beyond caution, had slipped from the palace, guided by instincts he could not name. The forest was alive with rustling leaves and distant calls of night creatures. Shadows danced across the twisted roots and moss-covered stones. The child's eyes, gray as storm clouds, scanned the dimming landscape, and he felt it, another presence. It was quiet, deliberate, and aware. Elira stepped from behind a cluster of trees, her figure small but poised. She held no weapon, only a satchel slung across her shoulder, filled with herbs and remedies. When she saw the boy, her eyes widened slightly, for he was unlike any royal child she had imagined. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no expectation of fear or obedience, only quiet intelligence and a sadness that spoke louder than words. Aelor moved closer, his small hand extended as if testing the air between them. Elira stiffened, unsure whether this was a trick, a challenge, or simply a curiosity. Yet something about the boy disarmed her. There was no judgment in his silence, no hunger for power, just a longing, a question that even his voice could not form. Suddenly, the sounds of the hunt shattered the fragile calm. Cries and the snapping of branches signaled that the Alpha King's guards were near. Elira grabbed Aelor's hand, pulling him deeper into the woods. They ran, not speaking, yet communicating through glances and gestures. Each step was measured, each turn deliberate, as if the forest itself bent to their needs. Aelor's silence was profound, but his presence was commanding. Even without words, he guided Elira through hidden paths, places where only the rejected and the brave dared to tread. She realized that his eyes saw things she could not, subtle shifts in the wind, the movement of the guards, the scent of danger lingering like smoke. By the time they reached a small clearing, the sun had vanished, leaving only the silver gleam of moonlight. Both were breathing heavily, yet neither had faltered. Elira studied the boy, noting the strength in his limbs, the careful precision in his movements, and the intensity of his gaze. She had heard of princes who were trained to fight, to command, to rule, but this child seemed to wield a power beyond sword or crown. Aelor reached for her again, pointing at her chest, and then at himself. He made a simple gesture, his hand open, palm toward her, fingers trembling slightly. He wanted something, and though Elira could not understand the words, he did not speak. She understood the emotion. "Do you trust me?" she whispered, though there was no need. Trust had been granted in that fleeting touch, in the quiet pulse of recognition between them. He nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, and in that moment, the world seemed to still. The moonlight fell on his pale hair, giving him an ethereal glow. And then he did something that made Elira's heart tighten. Aelor's hand pointed not at himself nor at the forest, but at her, and then he opened his mouth, forming the word that had never left his lips before. Mama. The word hung in the air like a fragile spell. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Elira's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked quickly to hide them. She had been rejected, abandoned, deemed unworthy, and yet this silent prince had spoken his first word for her. The enormity of it struck her to her core. Before she could respond, a shadow shifted among the trees. A figure, cloaked and swift, struck at them from the darkness. The boy reacted instinctively, stepping in front of Elira, his small body a shield. A glint of steel flashed, and the attack missed by mere inches. Elira grabbed his hand, pulling him back as another figure appeared, emerging from the mist. It was a hunter, one of the Alpha King's men, and he looked both surprised and furious to find the prince so far from the palace. The hunter raised his spear, eyes wide at the audacity of a child standing against him. Aelor, though small, did not flinch. His eyes glimmered with something primal, something ancient, and the wind seemed to swirl around him as if obeying his silent command. The hunter paused, unease flickering across his features. The boy's silence was not weakness. It was power waiting to awaken. Elira knew they could not stay. She whispered urgently, pulling him toward a narrow path between the trees, away from the guards. Aelor followed without hesitation, the moonlight catching the contours of his face, revealing a mixture of fear and determination that few could ever command. As they disappeared deeper into the forest, the hunter shouted behind them, summoning others. The hunt had become chaos, and the forest seemed to close in around them. Yet in that fleeting moment, a bond had been forged, a bond that neither time, curse, nor power could easily sever. They stopped at a hidden spring, its water glowing faintly under the moon's silver gaze. Aelor knelt, drinking quietly, and Elira watched him. The child had spoken one word, but it was enough. It was a spark, a beginning. She could feel the weight of destiny pressing on them, the threads of fate winding tightly around their lives. And in that quiet clearing under the watchful stars, Elira realized the truth. This boy, silent as he was, had already changed her world forever. But somewhere beyond the trees in the darkness, other eyes watched. Shadows that had long waited for the silent prince stirred, sensing the first tremor of a power that could not remain hidden. They would come. They always came, and yet for the first time Aelor had a voice. For the first time he had chosen to speak. Cliffhanger. As the moonlight shimmered on the spring, Aelor's hand trembled, pointing toward the horizon, and whispered again, though only Elira could hear it, "Mama, danger comes." And from the darkness a rustle of leaves told them they were not alone. The forest seemed alive that night, whispering secrets through rustling leaves and shifting shadows. Aelor and Elira crouched behind a thick trunk, listening to the distant steps of the hunters. Every footfall echoed like a drum in the silence of the woods. The prince's gray eyes glimmered with tension, and though no words came from him, his gaze spoke volumes, fear, alertness, and an unspoken question that lingered in the air between them. Elira took a slow, steadying breath. Her hands trembled slightly as she grasped his small ones, reassuring him without words. The first threat had passed, but they were far from safe. She could sense the danger pressing in from all sides, as if the forest itself were closing its arms around them. Testing their resolve, "We need to move," she whispered softly, her voice almost blending with the sighing wind. "They will not stop until they find us." Aelor nodded, his fingers tightening around hers. His small frame moved with surprising agility, guided by instincts that seemed beyond his years. Every step he took was deliberate, careful, yet he maintained an almost otherworldly confidence. Elira felt a strange mixture of awe and protectiveness toward him. He was a prince born to command, yet so fragile in ways words could not describe. The deeper they went, the darker the forest became. The trees grew taller and closer together, their twisted branches forming shadows that danced like ghosts in the moonlight. Strange whispers seemed to follow them, echoes of old magic, remnants of ancient curses that had lingered in Valdara for centuries. Elira shivered but pressed on. She had survived rejection and exile. She could survive this. As they reached a narrow path that wound along the edge of a cliff, Aelor stopped abruptly. His small hand shot out, pointing toward a hollow in the rocks. Elira crouched beside him and peered into the darkness. Inside, Faint glimmers of light revealed a hidden passage, one that seemed carved by hands long gone. "Through there," Aelor gestured urgently. The wordless command was clear. He wanted them to go inside, away from the hunters. They entered the hollow carefully, the cold stone pressing close around them. The air was damp, carrying the scent of earth and hidden life. Elira held her satchel close, her mind racing. How could a child so young guide her through a place so dangerous? And yet she felt a strange reassurance in his presence, as though the forest itself recognized him and bowed in quiet deference. Inside the passage, shadows moved strangely, as if alive. Elira's heart pounded, but she refused to let fear rule her. She could sense the boy's power growing, subtle yet undeniable. When he raised his hand, the shadows seemed to hesitate, yielding to his will. The realization struck her sharply. This child, silent as he was, commanded forces that even she could not fully understand. They continued deeper, and the passage opened into a cavern lit by the pale glow of luminescent moss. The walls shimmered like water, reflecting their faces in fractured patterns. Elira knelt beside Aelor, examining him with quiet wonder. The prince's lips moved slightly, forming words she could not yet hear. Yet his expression was full of emotion, determination, trust, and a longing that pierced her heart. For the first time, Elira allowed herself to speak of what she had felt when he said his first word. "Mama, it's a heavy word," she whispered, her fingers brushing his hair gently. "It carries hope and fear, love and danger, but it fits you." Aelor's eyes softened, and he tilted his head, studying her as if he understood every nuance of her speech. He reached out and traced her hand with his tiny fingers, a gesture full of trust and gratitude. It was a moment of fragile intimacy, yet charged with something neither of them could name. A bond that went beyond family, beyond protection, beyond fear. Their quiet moment was broken by a sudden tremor in the cavern floor. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the luminescent moss flickered as if the very magic of the forest had been disturbed. Elira held Aelor close, her instincts telling her that whatever followed would test them both. Through the shadows, a figure emerged. Not human, yet not entirely of the forest either. Its form was fluid, dark, and unsettling, moving with unnatural grace. Elira's breath caught in her throat, and Aelor stiffened beside her, sensing the danger even without words. The figure paused, observing them. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo in their minds rather than their ears, it spoke. "The silent prince, you awakened too soon." Aelor's eyes narrowed, and he raised a small hand. The shadows around the figure quivered, and for a brief moment, the forest itself seemed to obey him. Elira felt a surge of awe and fear. The boy was not merely mute. He was bound to ancient forces that had slumbered for generations. The figure tilted its head almost in curiosity, and then vanished into the darkness. Elira exhaled slowly, her heart still hammering. "Who, or what was that?" she whispered. Aelor did not answer with words. Instead, he pointed toward the exit of the cavern, then toward the distant mountains. The message was clear. They could not remain here. Danger lurked not just in men, but in powers older than the kingdom itself. They emerged from the cavern into a valley blanketed in silver mist. The air was colder here, and the wind carried whispers of ancient battles, of kings and queens who had fallen to curses of their own making. Elira wrapped her cloak tightly around Aelor and began walking, her mind racing. The prince had spoken once, and now he seemed determined to guide them through forces she could barely comprehend. As dawn approached, painting the sky with streaks of violet and gold, they reached a small clearing surrounded by twisted oaks. Here Aelor stopped again, kneeling beside a small spring. The water shimmered with an ethereal light, and he bent down to drink, his hands trembling slightly. Elira watched him, a strange mix of admiration and protectiveness swelling in her chest. "You are not like any child I have known," she murmured, placing her hand on his shoulder. "Not weak, not silent, not powerless. You are something. More." Aelor looked up at her, and for the first time he seemed to smile, a small shy curve of his lips. Though no words came, the expression spoke of trust, understanding, and a silent plea that she stay by his side. Suddenly, a crack echoed through the valley, and the mist seemed to ripple unnaturally. From the tree line, shadows emerged, figures cloaked in black moving with precision and intent. The hunters had found them again, but these were not ordinary men. Something about them felt wrong, unnatural. as though they had been sent not just to capture but to observe, to test. To claim, Illyra instinctively moved in front of Aelor, her satchel at the ready, though it contained only herbs and remedies. The figures advanced slowly, their movements eerily synchronized. One stepped forward, pointing directly at the boy. Illyra's heart skipped a beat. She knew this was more than a simple hunt. The boy's voice, his first word, had marked him. Aelor, small but unflinching, raised his hand. The shadows around the figures seemed to flicker and waver, as if uncertain. Illyra realized then that he was not just a child. He was a force of nature, bound to a destiny that could not be ignored. The lead figure stepped closer, and a voice, cold and sharp, cut through the morning air. "The Silent Prince, do you think your first word can change the world?" Aelor's gray eyes met the figure's gaze. He opened his mouth, forming another word, quiet, deliberate, yet carrying weight beyond his years. "Mama." The word echoed across the valley, reverberating through the mist and stone. The shadow figures paused, hesitation flickering in their movements. Illyra's breath caught in her throat. Once again he had spoken, and once again the word was for her. The mist began to swirl, forming shapes that were both threatening and mesmerizing. The valley seemed alive, responding to the boy's voice. Illyra realized that Aelor's words were not merely sound. They were power, magic, and declaration all at once. "We have to go," she whispered urgently, grabbing his hand, "before they realize what you are capable of." Aelor nodded, standing tall beside her. Though small, he radiated a strength that seemed older than the kingdom itself. Together they stepped forward, moving into the mist and shadows, guided not by fear but by an unspoken trust that had grown stronger with every moment. The valley held its breath. The forest watched, and the dawn light struggled to pierce the growing darkness. They were running, yet not merely from hunters or shadows. They were running towards something, a destiny that neither fully understood, yet could not deny. Cliffhanger. As they disappeared into the forest, a distant roar echoed across the mountains and deep, unnatural, and filled with promise of reckoning. Aelor froze, pointing toward the sound, and whispered to Illyra, "Mama, it comes." And somewhere beyond the trees the shadows stirred, waiting for the moment to strike. The palace of Valdara stirred with unease as dawn crept over the kingdom. Word had reached the Alpha King. His only son, the Silent Prince, had vanished. Whispers filled the halls, of curses awakening, of prophecy, and of a rejected Omega woman whose presence had somehow drawn the prince from his chambers. The king's face, carved from stone by years of command and unyielding pride, twisted with a mixture of fury and worry. "Aelor cannot remain outside," the king roared to his advisors. "He is my son. He is the heir. Bring him back. Bring him both back." His voice carried through the marble corridors, shaking the hearts of men who had long believed themselves untouchable. They knew the prince's silence was more than a defect. It was a mystery tied to the legacy of the kings before him. The king's fear was not for his son's safety alone, but for the power the boy might awaken if left unchecked. Meanwhile, in the forest beyond the palace, Aelor and Illyra moved with quiet urgency. The valley was behind them, and the misty trees now seemed to whisper warnings, guiding them along hidden paths. Each step was a balance of caution and trust. The prince's hand held hers, steadying her as much as she steadied him. Their bond had deepened overnight, spoken in gestures, glances, and silent understanding. Aelor's power, subtle yet growing, was beginning to show. Where his eyes lingered, shadows bent slightly. The wind shifted, and even the smallest of creatures seemed to sense his presence. Illyra's heart swelled with awe and fear in equal measure. She had survived exile and rejection, but she had never encountered a child like this, someone whose silence carried weight and whose touch seemed to anchor both earth and air. They came to a clearing where the remnants of an ancient ruin stood, half buried in ivy and stone. Here. Illyra allowed herself a brief rest, kneeling by a small spring while Aelor examined the carvings on the crumbling walls. Though the boy did not speak, his gestures were precise, almost as if he were reading a story written in the language of the past. Illyra watched him quietly. "You are stronger than anyone imagines," she whispered. "Stronger than the hunters, stronger than the king, stronger than fear itself." Aelor looked at her, his eyes wide, and touched her hand gently. It was not just comfort he offered, it was a promise, a silent declaration of trust. But the peace was fleeting. From the shadows of the ruined walls, a low rumble echoed, a sound that seemed to rise from the very earth. The ground trembled slightly under their feet, and the trees bent as if caught in a sudden wind. Aelor froze, his small body tense with recognition. He pointed toward the distant hills, his hand trembling. Elira followed his gaze and felt a chill run down her spine. A figure emerged, larger than any man, cloaked in dark, shifting shapes. Its movements were fluid, unnatural, and yet there was an intelligence in its motion, a deliberate patience. The figure stopped, observing the two of them with eyes that gleamed faintly. Like embers in the gloom, Elira instinctively stepped in front of Aelor. "Stay behind me," she whispered, though she had no shield, no weapon, save for her courage and quick thinking. The figure tilted its head, studying the boy, and spoke in a voice that vibrated through the air and into their minds. "The Silent Prince, you awaken before the time. You speak, yet you know not the power you carry." Aelor's gray eyes narrowed, and he lifted a small hand almost instinctively. The shadows around the figure wavered, uncertain. It was then that Elira understood the truth. The prince's silence was not weakness. It was control, discipline, and an ancient force waiting to respond to his will. The figure's gaze softened slightly, as if recognizing something in him, before it dissipated into the trees. The wind carried its final words, "Your path is bound to hers whether you know it or not." Elira exhaled, relief and fear intermingling. She knelt beside the boy, brushing his hair from his forehead. "It seems the forest knows you are special," she murmured. "And perhaps it knows me too." Aelor's hand rested in hers, his tiny fingers curling around hers. He pointed toward the mountains again, toward a direction that led deeper into unknown lands. It was clear they could not return to the valley, nor could they face the hunters. They needed sanctuary, knowledge, and answers. As they moved, Elira thought of the prophecy whispered among the villagers. "The silent heir shall speak only to the rejected Omega, and through her, salvation or ruin shall come." She had never truly believed it before, but now, watching the boy guide her with gestures and the first words he had ever spoken, she understood that destiny had chosen them both. Night fell again, and the forest changed. Strange lights danced among the trees, neither fire nor moonlight, but something in between. Aelor walked steadily, unfazed, as if he understood the language of the lights. Elira followed closely, her senses alert. Something in the air hinted at danger. Yet there was also a promise of revelation, answers waiting beyond the shadows. Eventually, they came upon a cave carved into the side of a cliff, hidden behind a waterfall that glimmered under the moon. The entrance was dark and cool, the roar of the falling water masking their approach. Aelor knelt, inspecting the stones at the mouth of the cave. He gestured toward the interior, then toward the sky, silently asking if it was safe. Elira nodded. "We have no choice," she said, and led him inside. The cave was hollowed naturally, with walls slick from the constant spray of the waterfall. A small pool reflected their faces, distorted but recognizable. It was here, in the heart of stone and water, that they found a momentary reprieve. Aelor knelt beside the pool, tracing the ripples with his fingers. For a while they simply sat in silence, the sounds of the waterfall masking the distant world outside. The boy's first word had been spoken, but he had yet to form another. Elira wondered what else lay hidden behind his silence, what power or knowledge he could summon, and whether the forest itself would obey him. Suddenly, the cave trembled. A low, resonant growl filled the space, vibrating through stone and air. Aelor froze, his small hands rising as if to command the unseen force. Elira's heart pounded. This was no ordinary predator. It was ancient, aware, and intelligent. She realized that the prophecy, the curse, and the boy's silence were not mere stories. They were warnings, guiding them toward a destiny far greater than either could yet understand. The growl faded, replaced by a whispering wind that carried words only Aelor seemed to hear. He nodded once firmly and then pointed toward Elira, then toward the exit of the cave. It was clear. Whatever this force was, it respected him, but it would follow them if they lingered. Elira rose, holding his hand tightly. "We cannot fight what we do not understand," she whispered. "We must move, together." Aelor's gray eyes met hers, and for the first time he smiled openly. Though small and silent, his expression carried courage and determination far beyond his years. He had spoken once, but his actions spoke louder than any words ever could. As they stepped from the cave into the cold night air, the first signs of dawn painted the horizon. The hunters were nowhere in sight, but Elira knew they had not given up. And the shadows in the forest, the strange forces that seemed to respond to Aelor, would not let them go easily. Somewhere deep within the mountains, a roar echoed again, this time closer, louder. Aelor froze, pointing toward the source, and whispered, though only Elira could hear, "Mama." It waits. Her heart skipped a beat. Whatever lay ahead was not just a test of survival, but of trust, courage, and the bond between them. She tightened her grip on his hand. "Then we face it together," she said, her voice firm, carrying a promise she hoped he could feel. The forest held its breath, the mountains watched, and the first light of dawn touched the valley below. The journey had only just begun, and somewhere, hidden in the shadows, the kingdom's destiny stirred, waiting for the silent prince to speak again. Cliffhanger. As they ascended the mountain path, a flash of movement caught their eyes. A pair of glowing red eyes stared from the darkness, unblinking, fixed on them. Aelor trembled slightly, pointing at the eyes, and whispered to Elira, "Mama, not alone." The Alpha King sat in his throne room, his fists clenched so tightly the marble beneath them seemed to quake. Reports had reached him of Aelor's disappearance, of the Omega woman who had drawn the boy into the forest, and of strange forces stirring in Valdara's lands. Advisors whispered of curses, prophecies, and powers long forgotten, but the king's mind focused on only one truth. His son was in danger, and no command could undo what had begun. Outside the palace walls, soldiers prepared for a pursuit. They sharpened blades, readied horses, and murmured prayers to old gods. Yet despite their numbers and skill, a quiet fear lingered among them. Stories of the silent prince's first word had spread, "Mama," and with it the knowledge that the boy was no ordinary child. The forest had already answered to him, bending shadows, wind, and light in ways impossible to explain. In the forest, Aelor and Elira pressed forward, the mountain path steep and treacherous. The night was cold, and the mist clung to their skin like a thin, damp cloak. Still, neither faltered. The prince's hand rested in hers, steady and reassuring, guiding them through hidden paths only he seemed to see. They stopped at a ledge overlooking a valley shrouded in morning fog. The sight was breathtaking. Rivers curled like silver threads, trees stretched toward the sky, and in the distance mountains loomed like silent guardians. For a moment, Elira allowed herself to breathe, letting the beauty of the world around them calm the storm in her chest. "You see," she whispered, though not to Aelor but to herself, "there is more to this world than fear, than rejection, more than what the king teaches." Aelor tilted his head, watching her intently. Though his lips did not move, his eyes conveyed understanding, curiosity, and a quiet determination. He pointed first at her, then at the valley below. His message clear: they were not yet safe, and the world held both danger and wonder beyond what they could imagine. The moment of peace was shattered when a low, resonant growl echoed from the mist below. Elira's heart froze. The sound was deep and unnatural, vibrating through the ground and into their bones. Aelor's hand rose instinctively, his fingers trembling yet firm. Shadows shifted around them as if responding to his silent command. Elira swallowed hard. "Whatever it is, we face it together," she said, tightening her grip on his small hand. She felt his courage pass into her, silent yet undeniable. From the fog, a massive creature emerged, its form both familiar and otherworldly. Eyes glowed like molten gold, and its movements were fluid, deliberate, and full of intent. It was unlike any beast Elira had seen, yet there was intelligence behind its gaze, an understanding that made her shiver. Aelor stepped forward slightly, unafraid. He pointed at the creature, then at Elira, as if commanding it to wait. The creature hesitated, growling softly, but it did not attack. Instead, it studied the boy, as though weighing the power that had awakened within him. Elira gasped softly. "Do you control it?" she whispered. Aelor's gaze met hers, and he nodded faintly. Though silent, he radiated authority far beyond his years. His presence alone seemed to command the forces around him, shadows, creatures, and even the wind that whispered through the mountains. The creature let out a low rumble, then retreated into the mist, leaving only the echo of its warning. Alira exhaled, a mix of awe and fear coursing through her. The prophecy. It speaks the truth, she murmured. You were meant for this, Aloy, even if you do not yet understand it. The journey continued, and the forest grew denser, the shadows deeper as if guarding secrets too old to remember. They moved carefully, guided by Aloy's instincts, which seemed almost supernatural. He paused often, listening to the rustling leaves, the shifting air, the faintest sounds of movement, then gestured toward paths that Alira would have missed entirely. Night fell again and the forest transformed. The luminescent moss glowed faintly, casting long, ghostly shadows across their path. Aloy's steps were confident, but the tension in his body was visible. He was aware of every sound, every movement, every unseen presence that might threaten them. Alira stayed close, feeling both fear and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She had never met anyone like this child. He was fragile and small, yet the weight of destiny rested on his shoulders. His silence was not emptiness. It was a reservoir of strength, patience, and wisdom far beyond his age. They arrived at a hidden glade, where the trees opened to reveal a small, crystal-clear pond. The water reflected the moonlight, and for a moment the forest's dangers seemed to vanish. Alira knelt beside the pond, brushing her fingers over its surface while Aloy explored the perimeter, attentive to every detail. You are not alone, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Even in the darkest places, someone will always stand by your side. Aloy looked at her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. He raised a hand and traced her hand with his fingers, a silent acknowledgement of her words. In that moment, a fragile trust blossomed between them, unspoken but absolute. The boy's first word had been Mama, and though he had not yet spoken again, his gestures, his presence, and his eyes conveyed a language deeper than any spoken tongue. Their quiet moment was shattered by a sudden rumble. The ground trembled slightly beneath their feet, and the water in the pond rippled unnaturally. Alira grabbed Aloy instinctively, pulling him close. A shadow moved along the edge of the glade, subtle yet deliberate. Something ancient and powerful was approaching. Aloy raised his hand, pointing toward the shadow. Though his lips did not move, the gesture was commanding, almost like a spell. The shadow hesitated, wavering as if unsure. Alira realized then that the boy's silence was not weakness. It was mastery over forces that most would fear to name. The shadow figure stepped forward into the moonlight, revealing itself, tall, cloaked, and with eyes that gleamed with unnatural light. It spoke not with words, but with a presence that filled the glade. The silent prince, your awakening stirs the old powers. Speak and they will obey, or remain silent and they will wait. Aloy's gray eyes met the figure's gaze, unflinching. He raised his hand again, pointing at Alira, and whispered, though only she could hear, Mama, stay close. Alira's heart ached at the tenderness in his voice, at the mixture of fear, courage, and trust that it carried. She nodded, brushing his hair from his forehead. I will, she said firmly. Always. The figure regarded them silently for a long moment, then retreated into the shadows, leaving only the echo of its presence and a sense of looming destiny. Alira realized the truth. Aloy was no longer just a child. He was a force of nature, tied to powers older than the kingdom, and the choices they made together would shape the future of Valdara. As they continued along the mountain path, the first light of dawn broke across the horizon. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the wind still, as if waiting for the next movement of the silent prince. Aloy stopped, pointing toward the valley below, then back at the rising sun. His eyes glimmered with resolve, and though his lips did not move, his gestures spoke of readiness, courage, and the promise of new beginnings. Alira smiled softly, her heart full. We will face it together, she whispered again, though this time with a stronger conviction. No matter what comes. But the forest had other plans. From the tree line, the faintest rustle signaled movement. Shadows lengthened, and the wind carried a distant guttural sound. Aloy froze, pointing toward the noise, and whispered to Alira, Mama. It returns. Her heart leapt into her throat. Whatever waited for them was patient, powerful, and ancient. Yet as she looked into the boy's gray eyes, she felt a strange reassurance. They had survived the forest, the hunters, and the shadows. Together they could face anything. The sun climbed higher, casting light on the valley and revealing the vast expanse of the world before them. Aloy's silence remained, but it no longer felt empty. It was filled with purpose, with power, and with trust that no curse could break. Cliffhanger. As they descended the mountainside, a figure appeared atop a distant ridge, a lone silhouette watching them silently. Elor's hand trembled slightly as he pointed at it, whispering to Elira, "Mama, the king knows." The shadow of the past was closing in, and the boy's silence was about to be tested like never before. The morning sun broke over Valdara with a pale golden light, casting long shadows across the kingdom. From the distant ridge, the silhouette of the Alpha King watched. His heart was heavy, torn between fear for his son and pride in the boy's courage. The silent prince, the child who had spoken his first word in a moment of defiance and love, was no longer hidden. He was awakening to the destiny the kingdom had long feared and awaited. Elor stood beside Elira at the base of the mountains, his gray eyes scanning the horizon. The distant silhouette of the king sent a shiver through her. She squeezed the boy's hand gently, letting him feel her steady presence. "We face him together," she whispered, echoing the promise they had made to one another. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of the palace, the smell of stone and banners, of fear and authority. Elor lifted his small hand and gestured toward the city below. Shadows stirred in the trees and along the cliffs, responding to him. The creatures that had followed silently, waiting, now drew closer, their forms half seen in the morning light. Elira's heart raced. She had never seen a child command such attention from the world around him. Yet there was no fear in him, only determination, trust, and the quiet strength of one who understood the weight of destiny. From the ridge above, the Alpha King descended. His presence was commanding, his armor shining, his sword at his side. Yet he did not charge, he did not call. He merely watched, his eyes fixed on the boy who had stirred forces long dormant. Elor's gaze met his father's. For a heartbeat, time seemed to still. The forest, the shadows, even the wind held their breath. Then the boy took a step forward, holding Elira's hand, his small voice forming words he had never spoken before. "Stop," he said firmly, his tone carrying across the valley. Though soft, it held an authority that could not be denied. The king paused, eyes narrowing, and then slowly lowered his sword. The soldiers behind him mirrored his actions, hesitant, uncertain, as if the boy's voice commanded not just hearts but the very air itself. Elira knelt beside Elor, whispering, "You can do this. We can do this together." Elor's gray eyes glimmered with a strange light. He lifted his hand toward the king, then toward the horizon, signaling the power within him. The shadows around the soldiers flickered and the wind swirled, carrying faint whispers that seemed like warnings. The boy was no longer silent, yet his voice was just one part of the force he commanded. The king took a step forward, and his voice rumbled across the valley. "Elor, my son, you are my blood, my heir, but why do you follow her? Why do you bind yourself to someone cast out by the kingdom?" Elor did not respond with words, only gestures. He pointed to Elira, then to himself, then to the horizon. The meaning was clear. She was his guide, his protector, and together they would face what was coming. Elira rose beside him, her presence calm but resolute. "He chooses his path," she said softly, "not because of rebellion, but because he sees the truth the kingdom cannot. Love, courage, and strength are not bound by titles or fear." The king's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. Then the ground trembled beneath them and a low roar echoed from the mountains. The creature from the forest, ancient and immense, emerged from the mist. Its eyes glowed with the fire of centuries, and its presence carried the weight of prophecy and power. Elor stepped forward, small but unyielding. He lifted his hand and the creature paused, recognizing the boy's command. Shadows shifted and light bent, responding to the prince's silent authority. The soldiers and advisors gasped, realizing that the child before them was not merely human, but a bridge between the kingdom and forces older than any crown. The king knelt slightly, lowering his gaze. "Elor, you are more than I imagined," he admitted, voice tinged with awe and humility. "I see now. Your silence was never weakness. It was control, wisdom, and strength." Elor raised both hands, gestures flowing like music, calling the shadows, the wind, and the creature to obey. Elira held his hand, lending him courage and warmth. The silent prince, once powerless in words, now stood as a force that could shape the destiny of Valdara itself. The soldiers watched in awe as the creature bowed slightly to Aelor, acknowledging his authority. The shadows shifted, forming a protective ring around the boy and Alira. Even the wind seemed to carry their unspoken promise. Together, they would face whatever came. The king stepped closer, his voice now calm, almost reverent. "You have shown me what it means to lead and what it means to trust. You have chosen well, my son." Aelor's small lips curved into a faint smile. He pointed toward Alira, and his gray eyes sparkled with gratitude, trust, and something deeper than words could ever capture. The word he had spoken first, Mama, had carried hope, courage, and the promise of new beginnings. Alira knelt beside him, brushing his hair from his eyes. "You have done it," she whispered. "Not just spoken, but commanded, led, and chosen your path. You are no longer silent, Aelor. You are heard, and you are seen." The king extended his hand toward the boy, who hesitated for a moment before placing his small one in his father's. The gesture was powerful, more than any words could describe. Reconciliation, recognition, and the acceptance of destiny. From the forest, the shadows began to recede. The ancient creature returned to the mist, its presence no longer threatening but protective, a silent guardian of the new order. The soldiers lowered their weapons, awe and reverence replacing fear. The kingdom of Valdara watched in silence, bearing witness to the awakening of its heir. Alira stood beside Aelor, holding his hand, and for the first time allowed herself to feel the depth of their bond. The boy, once silent, had found his voice through courage, trust, and love. Together they had faced the forest, the shadows, and the fear within hearts both young and old. The king looked at Alira, a hint of gratitude and respect in his eyes. "You have guided him, protected him, and shown him the way," he said softly. "For that you have my thanks, and my blessing." Alira nodded, feeling a warmth in her chest she had not known for years. "We have found our path," she replied simply, "and we will follow it together." Aelor's gray eyes sparkled in the sunlight. He looked at the king, then at Alira, then at the mountains and forests beyond. He raised his hand and pointed toward the horizon, signaling the journey ahead. Though the boy's words were few, his gestures carried the weight of a kingdom's future and the promise of a destiny fulfilled. The silent prince, once unheard, now commanded the forces of the forest, the mountains, and the shadows. His first word, spoken in a moment of love and defiance, had opened the path to redemption, courage, and transformation. He was no longer just the king's son. He was a bridge between worlds, a light in darkness, and a testament to the power of choice, trust, and unspoken strength. The kingdom of Valdara would remember this day, not for battles fought with swords or blood, but for the awakening of a child who spoke once simply and changed everything. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the valley, Aelor looked at Alira and whispered again, though softly, "Mama." Alira smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes, my child," she replied, her voice steady and full of love. "Always, my child." And in that moment, the silent prince found his voice, his power, and his place in a world that had once rejected him. The forest, the shadows, and the kingdom itself bowed to his awakening, and the prophecy fulfilled itself not through fear, but through courage, trust, and the bond between two hearts. The kingdom watched in awe as father and son, guided by love and courage, walked together, their shadows stretching long into the morning light, carrying with them a promise that even in silence there can be power, even in rejection there can be love, and even in fear there can be hope.